Okay, friends, we are live. We'll wait a couple minutes here just to get some viewers in. As you can see, it's only getting more and more casual as we continue these discussions. So casual that Sean's gonna dip behind me here for a sec. He thinks he's sneaky, but he's not. Gatsby's also around, but nowhere for him to jump up this week. Um, got my Weezer shirt on, one of my most comfy shirts. Got some wine this time, so I'm ready to go. I hope you guys had time to catch up on the first few episodes of The Vow. I think it's going very well right now, and I am so excited to keep watching. You can hear Gatsby tippy tapping, so you know he is still here. I'm so excited to see where the series goes. I think I mentioned this the last time, but it's so it's so weird to still be so interested in something that I know so much about and still learn things kind of every time that I watch something different. So that's something I'm excited about. I think I fixed some of the streaming problems I had the last go around, but if someone who's watching just wants to let me know if you can hear me and see me and all that good stuff, that would be super. Um, Sean's playing some video games in the background, so if you hear some laughing or some Call of Duty issues, that's what's going on there. All right. So since I took last week off, I'm sorry that I kind of like left y'all hanging, but I was on vacation. I went to the beach, and so I said, I'm gonna let myself do a little bit of relaxing. And oh, good. Chris says he can hear and see. Good. Thank you, Chris. So I did a little bit of relaxing. I was like, I'll just do a full-on relax kind of reset, and be back this week. And we're actually going to talk about episode 2 and episode 3. So again, this is like super casual. If you guys have comments or questions at any point, just pop them in the chat. If you've joined us from Twitter or Facebook, just a reminder to do the questions here in the YouTube live chat, because I'm not going to be like popping back and forth to Twitter and Facebook during this. Maybe if I had like 6 screens all in front of me, I would do that, but I do not. Okay, so the end of episode 1 gave us like a pretty good cliffhanger where you can kind of like see Bonnie starting to figure out, something's just like not quite right with everything that's going on. And she starts to have like a conversation with Mark a little bit and says, I don't think you're seeing what I see. I'm seeing all of these red flags, and I'm gonna leave, basically. And she says this thing to Mark where she says, there's no way out, that, they won't let you leave very easily. And that's something that I've kind of heard from a lot of people who I've talked to who have been involved in this, is that, once you start to get involved, it's very difficult to leave. And that's kind of the whole point of this system that Keith built. So I thought it was very telling that, they started off with that, and they kind of drove it home how difficult it was to walk away. So let's see. Bonnie goes, I took these notes a little while ago, so I'm just making sure that I'm getting everything right on these episodes that I'm talking about. So Bonnie talks about the Simply Human singing group, which is the ESP singing group, where she kind of got to know Allison Mack a little bit more. And Allison is really, I think for a lot of people who are interested in like the Hollywood aspect of NXIVM, Allison is really kind of the face and the name that got a lot of people's attention when this started to be uncovered. Because I mean, I know I used to watch Smallville all the time when it was on, and so for people my age and maybe like a little bit older, they definitely knew her face and definitely knew her name. So Bonnie goes on to talk about, the intense schedule on the stripe path, and she kind of, there's points where she'll go through her whole day and she'll have like this checklist of things that she's doing, and she's got something scheduled for every single day. And I thought that that was really interesting to see kind of what her days looked like, because there was a point in the trial, um, where there was a woman who was on the stand who had been in NXIVM and had been kind of part of this stuff, and she was talking about like all of her check-ins, and when she had to check in with Keith and Nancy, like about her weight and if she worked out that day and all these things that she was doing. And so I thought that this kind of daily schedule that Bonnie laid out was very telling as far as those other things that I've kind of seen and heard from covering this. So she starts to talk about, red flags with Allison, and notice like obsessing over her weight. And I think that that's a very interesting thing to bring up, just as a woman, because I think kind of all women obsess over their weight, but there is that kind of point where it's more than just wanting to be healthy, or more than just trying to get a little bit fitter. You can tell when, there is kind of something else behind those thoughts. Um, at one point in this is episode 2, Keith had said something along the lines of that servitude is not slavery. And I thought that that was so, it just showed how particular he was about his choice of words. And I think he was particular about it when he speaks and when he writes and when he comes up with these teachings and things like that. And he's very deliberate. I think that's a good word. He's very deliberate in his word choice. But enslaved is exactly what Bonnie was feeling, and she kind of described that, and she ran away and she escaped. And I think it was so brave of her to really, put all of these friendships that she had developed, because they were friendships. I mean, you saw, if you watched this, you saw the videotapes of Bonnie and Mark's wedding, and Mark talking about how it was mostly like people from ES ESP there, and this was really her whole life. And I think it is just such an act of bravery for her to be scared and still walk away, and still, you know, be willing to give up this like love between her and Mark for her own well-being. And I think it's just really impressive and really brave. Um, So yeah, she talks about how she knew that Allison had made some sort of lifetime vow, but that she didn't really see, the darkness that Doss was kind of creating. And I'm not sure if I went over this last time. You would know if you've watched, the next couple of episodes, that Doss is kind of this like subgroup sorority within Nexium, and that's really what got a lot of the attention once it broke. That's where, all the branding and the starvation and that kind of stuff came from. Um, One of the things I thought was so interesting was to actually, see the relationship between Mark and Keith. And I think that it speaks volumes because it shows how Keith could like bring you in and make you feel part of the inner circle, and make you feel like you're really important and like you're doing all this good in the world. And I can see how it would be so attractive to someone like Mark, or even someone like Bonnie or Sarah or anyone who's in this group, to feel like they were in Keith's inner circle. So I think that the way that that kind of plays out in episode 2 is so important to pay attention to. And I think, again, like in the words that he chooses, Keith is very deliberate in the relationships that he chooses. He's bringing in people close to him who he thinks are going to be, trustworthy, and do what he says and believes in his mission and all of these other things. And Mark was very much that at that time. The other thing that was funny was, they spent a lot of time on the volleyball games, these late night volleyball games that Keith would hold. And when I first started covering all of this, and I was talking to Chet Harden, who used to write for Metroland, which doesn't exist anymore, but it was a newspaper in the Albany area, and he was like one of the only one. He was like one of the first journalists like ever, even like ahead of the TU, to start really digging into this. And he was able to actually at one point get what he called an audience with Keith. And but he had to go to volleyball to talk to him. And he was describing to me all this stuff about how it was so weird. All these women were around, and it really was like, yeah, they were like kind of playing volleyball, but like mostly everyone was there to see Keith. And I think that they really that there's a lot of footage from volleyball in these episodes that, I've never seen before. And I guess this last time too about some of the footage, but being able to actually see some of that stuff in action that you've learned so much about is gives you like such a bigger picture of what was going on. And it is just like really bizarre to think about how I kind of imagine those things happening in my head before having a picture and then actually seeing it now. So we get to end of episode 2, and someone else decides to leave and tells Mark about the vow, and he's like floored by it, obviously. Finally, like kind of coming around to what Bonnie was seeing and trying to tell him about and trying to convince him. He turns around and he starts talking to Sarah about it, and there's this really intense conversation at the end of episode 2 between Mark and Sarah. And Sarah's kind of like, oh, like, I know you like to record things, and I don't want this to be recorded. And, it kind of cuts off at the end with Mark saying, I'll stop the recording, like, and we'll talk or whatever. But before that, Sarah basically, tells him that she's been branded. And it's very intense. I can't imagine having one of my like best friends come to me and be like, I'm trapped in this thing and I'm scared to talk to you about it. And also, like, I've had this cauterizing pen like dragged across my skin with no anesthesia, and now I'm branded with this guy's initials. And that is just like terrifying to me. So I think like an important thing to bring up that episode 2 doesn't really touch on is that, you know, Bonnie and this other friend, and then eventually Sarah and Mark, are not the first people to ever leave NXIVM. They're the first people to leave, like, when DOS starts being created and it starts getting a little bit more intense. But I think a lot of these red flags that they saw were always around, because there is kind of this group of people called the NXIVM 9, and they left previous to all of this, and were very much shunned by the people who were still in the group. And it was a very intense situation. And one of the women who left is was the leader of one of the centers out west. And so it very much parallels kind of like what Sarah ends up doing, which I think leads us into episode 3, which starts off with the brand basically. And that's kind of, I'm going to back up for a second here. So it starts off with the brand, and kind of like, I think that's where like all of the media attention that this story started with. But I think it's important that, it doesn't really come into play in the documentary until episode 3, because I think that really shows how much was going on, behind the scenes and kind of before all of this happened, before the branding started. So it kind of like is the lead up and shows the building blocks as to why this was able to happen, basically. Gatsby, stop that. Sorry, he's doing something dumb. So much happened in episode 3, and I think I'm still just trying to analyze it all. But Mark is talking to Sarah about, kind of what she's been doing with this group and kind of what's been going on. And I think that the way he's talking to her here is so interesting, because I don't think he was trying to be mean to her, and it may have come off that way, but I think it so concisely sums up what people who have been part of this, who have now kind of like seen the light, we'll say, are feeling. It's like, okay, well, like I was part of this and this happened to me, but I was also part of this happening to other people. I think I talked about this in the first little live bit that we did as well. I think it's a very like some people are a little embarrassed and a little upset with themselves that they did things that led other people into these groups. And so I think that conversation Mark has with Sarah is very eye-opening and very telling. This episode also goes into kind of the key points of ESP. And like one of the very first things on this like list of like commandments Keith hands out is that I will not choose to be a victim. And that is just really, I think, and I have no way to know if it started this way, if it was always this way, or if it did start out as something good, but I feel like that is just such like a gaslighting type of thing, to tell someone that like they only choose to be a victim, because you can victimize people without them choosing to be a victim. I don't think anyone would choose to be a victim if they could choose, something else. So I just thought that was important for them to put into this episode, because I think it just really shows how Keith was able to just manipulate, and how he was able to manipulate and kind of form people's minds to follow his thought process and kind of buy into this thing he was literally selling. One of the other things in episode 3 is that you really get your first good look at Lauren Salzman, and she looks like a different person in this footage than kind of what we saw during trial. You can really see how charismatic she is, and how like you would want to be her friend too, just as much as like I was talking about with Mark and Keith. Like she looked so fun. If I was just seeing that footage of her and it wasn't part of this documentary, like I would want to go out and be friends with her. And I think that was a big part of this whole system, was that you got these people who were going to be good stewards of these classes and these systems and these thoughts and all of these things, and they gained your trust, and eventually, you would like blindly follow them essentially. So I thought that giving a good look into her and kind of how she was candidly was really cool. One of the other things that kind of episode 3 goes into is V Week, which, and I can't remember if the documentary mentioned this or not, but V Week is a celebration of Keith's birthday, and it started off being like one day, and then 2 days, then it was like a weekend, and eventually it turned into this week-long thing. And they held it up at this YMCA camp on Silver Lake, which is up in the Adirondacks, like kind of near Lake George, if you're familiar with that area at all. And I will never forget when we found out about that. Someone who I was working with at Channel 10 at the time was like, I used to vacation up there and we would see them every year, and it was the weirdest thing I've ever seen. And he was telling us like how just bizarre and like secretive it was. And he was always like, my parents told me not to go talk to those people. It's just like really bizarre how intertwined all of this was with the capital region. Um, so yeah. I also thought something interesting that was going on was, oh, when Sarah gets married to Nippy in the third episode, she goes back to the wedding vows that Keith wrote for Bonnie and Mark, and she and Nippy, decide to use the same vows. And I just thought that was just like another way that Keith was instilling his beliefs and like his system and what he wanted people to do and how he wanted them to act into people, because you listen to those couple of lines that they play for you in the documentary, and it's like, oh my gosh, like this is super culty, like looking back on it. So then we really start to get into Doss and how Lauren comes to Sarah and basically tells her, there's this secret women empowerment group that we've got, but if you want to be part of it, you have to give me all this collateral and tell me about things, even if they're not true, that could ruin your life if they get let out. So she does. And basically, she is now in this group now, and Lauren is her master, and Lauren's part of, this pod of, I think it's like 6 women, and they each have slaves. So Sarah kind of relates it to back like when she started with ESP, how weird she thought certain things were, including like the stripe path and stuff like that. And she's like, oh yeah, it's all weird, until Lauren starts to explain to you why it's not weird. And then you're like, okay, like this is just what we're doing right now. So I think Sarah does a really, just a very like blunt and obvious way of explaining some of these things that maybe when you think about it without hearing someone who was part of it talk about it, you're like, I don't really understand. And I think I mentioned this last go around as well. A lot of people are like, I don't understand how these people could be so tricked. Like, I don't understand how they could just fall into this. Like, aren't they smart enough to figure this out? But I think that Sarah's explanation of it really shows you how these really intelligent, these really fantastic people kind of got roped into this thing. Um, so then Sarah starts to talk about, when Lauren takes her to get what she's told is a tattoo as part of this group. And lo and behold, she gets shipped off to Allison Mack's condo blindfolded, and it is basically a trip to be cauterized with this like burning tool into the symbol that I think if you've been following this at all, that you kind of know what it looks like. She was told that it was a tattoo based on the elements. So it's like the earth and the sky and the water. And I think at this point we all know that it's not what that is. When you turn it on its side, it is Keith Raniere's initials, and some people will also say that they can see Allison's initials in it. But it's definitely at least one or the other or both. And I can't imagine what that was like when you realize, I've got this thing burned into my skin. It's not even a tattoo that I can go and get removed or cover up. Like, it is literally burned into my skin, and it's these people's initials. So this is kind of the point where like it all starts to like come down on Sarah, and she figures it out about, what's going on, and she's like mortified basically that she's part of this. So, obviously the end of episode 3 is so awesome when Sarah just like goes to the Vancouver Center, and she's like, this is what's happening. Like, you're all part of it. I want to tell you this so that you have all of the information. I'm leaving. I'm grabbing my stuff. You shouldn't bring anyone else into this. And she has this like, excuse my language, she has this like bad bitch moment where she's like, see ya. Like, and you could tell she is like on the path to make this known to people. And it was just so powerful and incredible. And I thought it was great. I also thought it was so interesting to see Nippy talk and to see some footage of him, because I sat next to him through a lot of the trial, and we talked to each other, but I didn't know, he knew who I was, but I didn't know who he was. Sarah and I talked through Twitter a little bit, and she had messaged me a couple days later, and she was like, oh, you've been sitting next to my husband watching the trial. And I was like, oh my goodness. So yeah, so it's just really really interesting. And that's pretty much all I've got on those next 2 episodes. If anyone has any questions or any comments, I think I went back on last week's video that I posted, and it looked like a lot of people. Not like a lot of people. Okay, for me, a lot of people. I have 7 whole comments on last week's video, which is a lot for me as, not a YouTuber in any way, shape, or form. But I was so happy to see that people went back and commented. And Aaron Gordon said that episode 3 was awesome. and that there's 6 more episodes, so they're going deep, and I would agree with that. I am very excited to see kind of a little bit like selfishly, but I'm excited to see how some of the episodes pan out where they talk about the trial and stuff, because obviously I have a lot more knowledge of that than anything that I wasn't involved with. That's just kind of, my secondhand knowledge and whatnot. But I'm excited to see parts of the trial and how that's portrayed. And I'll definitely be able to give you all a better idea when those episodes come up, if it is like how it happened, if that makes sense. Daniel asks, did you have any interactions with the Raniere supporters at the trial? It is like so difficult to answer that question, which I know is probably not the answer that you wanted, but my photographer and I, Chris, like would talk about this because we are like 4-hour drives back and forth between Albany and Brooklyn some days during this. And we would talk about like some people who were hanging around, and we'd be like, so you go to these trials, and not just with this trial, but like with any trial, like when we were doing the Dean Skelos trial in Manhattan, or even like when you're doing local trials, you're kind of like, okay, these are the people who are here every day. And you kind of figure out, okay, they're on the victim side, or they're on the defendant side, or they're media, or whoever they are. And you kind of place people into boxes, kind of. You're like, okay, I know who these people are. Especially as a journalist, because you're looking around for people to interview, right? Um, and we would have interactions with people, or there'd be like people who would show up some days, but not days. And then there were some people who would like really be interested in talking to us. But I think if there were supporters there who I had interactions with, I don't think that they would ever like outright come and be like, I support Keith Raniere. Like if if they're supporters and they have been watching any media coverage, I don't think they would come and tell me of all people that, because I think it's pretty obvious, how many conversations I've had with people like Tony Natali and Catherine Oxenberg and, Chet and, all these other people. I don't think that they would come out and tell me of all people that they were Raniere supporters, but I do think that they were there. So yeah, I hope that answers your question a little bit, Daniel. Let's see. Okay, I'm gonna pop back over to the comments from last week and just see if anyone else has questions, pop them in the chat, and I'll come back over to that tab in a second here. Someone commented on the post from the other week and said that they also fell victim to a cult in Hawaii. So I'm gonna look that up a little bit and see if I can find any information on that. I don't know if you guys could hear that. Gatsby's whining in the background. Are you getting no attention? It's so sad. The face of neglect as he wags his tail. So I'm definitely going to look into that a little bit and see if there's any information, because I would love to know more about that. Someone else posted that they liked my little slow introduction, so I'm glad that benefited, someone out there. And it's kind of cool that people who hadn't been paying as close of attention, came and watched what I've been doing. I know this is like super casual and not what you guys usually get from me, but just reading some stuff over here. This same person asked if I've asked like certain questions about crimes against children and ideas within the subgroup and things like that. And unfortunately, I have been unable to secure a prison interview with Keith, so I don't have the answers to that. I would love to do that. It would be so interesting. Let's see. It looks like people are having some good conversations on this from last week, so I'm going to have to read them a little bit more closely when I can pay attention. But if you guys have thoughts like afterwards that you want to post, and we can talk about them last week or next week, which I promise it will happen next week and not 2 weeks from this week. So yeah, you guys can post them on the video, which will be posted kind of after we wrap this up and things like that. Any questions that come to mind, points that like I didn't touch on that you would want me to touch on, and things like that. So I know that this announcement for this live chat was a little bit later than the other one, and I'll try to give you guys a little bit more heads up. But Tuesdays at 8, I think, work pretty well for me most of the time, so that's when I will try to do them. If you'd like to tune in next week, we'll talk about episode 4, maybe if I can find some information on that. Cult in Hawaii, we'll talk about that a little bit. So yeah, that's pretty much all I've got for tonight. Kind of a little short one. Oh, Chris has one more thing to say here. I did see that like navel chain that she had too, Chris, and I can't remember if they mentioned it in this documentary or if I had read it before, but I think that was kind of a thing before the brands happened, was that they were wearing those as like a sign of being part of DOS or something like that. So, hi, Chris Mead. Chris Mead is doing double duty right now, hanging with me and also playing video games with Sean. So I deeply appreciate it. So the next They did mention it, right? Okay, I thought they did mention it in the documentary, but I couldn't remember. I feel like I joke all the time. I'm like, a quarter of my brain is Bruce Springsteen lyrics, a quarter of my brain is like everyday stuff, and then the other half is like all my NXIVM knowledge, and I have like no other space in my brain for anything else. It just like goes in and out. But yeah, that I believe is what the chain was from. Do not quote me on that, but I think that was kind of like their symbol of commitment before the branding came around. So to answer Chris's question, I'm excited to just kind of see, the the relationships between kind of the characters who have been introduced so far and kind of how those develop more as they start leaving, because I think at this point, at the end of episode 3, I think at this point, kind of our four, we got Mark, Bonnie, Sarah. Oh, I think I saw Catherine in a preview. Maybe I'm counting her as 4. But it'll be really interesting to see how they bring Catherine into all of this, because I think I mentioned it in the last chat, but she really like did her work and like got together all of this information and literally marched into the FBI office and was like, here, this is what's happening. So I will be really interested to see kind of how they bring her in and how she's presented. She was at the trial a little bit. I think it was it was hard for her because India wasn't totally out, I think, in the beginning of that, out of NXIVM. So it was definitely difficult, I think, for her to be there. But I've talked to her a little bit since, and I think things are going much better. So Daniel says they show Catherine's house, and it is glorious. She is like, okay, so I didn't watch the original Dynasty, but apparently anyone who did, like, she is like super famous. She's also like a legitimate princess. Like, she comes from a royal background, which is like the coolest thing ever, I think. She also is like the nicest and most awesome human being of all time. She is so like down to earth and nice, and she also has great fashion sense. That doesn't really have anything to do with anything. Yes, Chris Lemon, you're right. Captive by Catherine is so good. I have a copy, but it's all the way in my room. That was like the first book that anyone released on NXIVM, and it really shows like how she kind of like gathered all of this information to present to the FBI, and she's really like a force behind all of this. So I highly suggest Captive. Also, definitely read The Program by Tony Natali, because that will kind of give you like the backstory to everything that you ever need to know. she is like a wealth of knowledge, and she's also got like this little in between part. Oh, I should have brought my books. I had them behind me last time. I'm not going to go grab them now. But she has like this insert in the middle of the program, and it's got all these like old pictures of Keith, and like if for nothing else, go and check those out because they're weird. um all right, so I think that will do it for tonight. Again, 8 o'clock next Tuesday. Be here or be square. And any questions or things you want to talk about from episode 4 or anything else that's coming up, leave them in the comments of this video, and we'll see you then. Bye, everyone.